Welcome aboard the Athletics Can't Wait Jets podcast, your nonstop shop for all things Jets with Tim McMaster, Zack Rosenblatt, and Marissa Dunn.
Can't wait.
The draft is over. The schedule is out. The Jets are back on the field. OTAs in May, not exactly playoff practices, but it does mean the Jets are on the field. Aaron Rodgers taking snaps. The rookies getting used to the NFL. Who looks good without pads? Who doesn't? We're going to cover that. Plus a new running back added to the roster today. And wide receivers continue to secure the bag around the NFL. We'll talk about that and how it will impact the Jets in the probably near future. Thanks for joining the Can't Wait podcast. I'm Tim McMaster along with Zack Rosenblatt, our Jets reporter at The Athletic, and Marissa Dunn, our producer. You've been out there a couple days, Zack. Nice warm weather for you for OTAs. We'll get into it, but does it just feel good to be out watching football being played?
Yeah, this time of the year is always a strange feeling because mentally you're like, all right, it's the off season, you can unplug, and then you're like, they have practices still. But it's more just seeing the new guys out in the field, seeing how the quarterbacks look. You can't really get a lot from this, but Aaron Rodgers, injured guys coming back from the year before, who's all out there, who isn't, all that kind of stuff. It's fun. I mean, football this time of the year, we haven't had football in a while, obviously, at this point. Right now, it's just the basketball playoffs and the hockey playoffs. There's not a lot of sports. I mean, baseball is going on right now, but it's the point of the season where most people don't care, I would say. So I think it's always fun overreacting to things we see in OTA practice that we're going to completely forget about by the time training camp comes around, and then we start really judging everybody. But Jets fans are always starved for this stuff this time of the year, and so I know they appreciate me live tweeting good plays and writing about how Aaron Rodgers looks. It gets them all excited for the rest of the summer.
Wait, you're saying there's overreaction that happens at Jets practice?
Not around here.
No.
Nobody overreacts around the Jets. But
never.
Yeah.
That's why you put Rodgers' line in your story, right? I think it was 8 of 10 on 11 on 11s, 5 of 5 and 7 on 7s, as if any of that matters. But
yeah, in the first practice that was,
to Jets fans, that's very important. So
yeah, especially because it's
covering
Aaron.
all the news.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, especially with the news that they might make OTAs go away and earlier training camp and all that crap. I don't know if fans actually care about that, but I know people in the league and media do. So.
You know who cares about that too? Marissa.
Yes.
How would you feel about no OTAs?
So it's funny because we were discussing this on a meeting of mine, and we're like, do people care? And I was like, well, I care. This is very important.
Sources close to the Browns say
this is very important to me. But yeah, I mean, you don't need my thoughts on OTAs, but I mean, it's good to see the guys out there, and I think we have a lot to get into today. So
I will say, not to drag this too much, but Marissa, one of the benefits of OTAs, right, is like Michael, for instance, is a guy who would never miss anything ever, right?
No, even though they're optional, he would never
earlier than he needs to be, later than he's just he's the gym rat type of player. So he's only been helped, I would imagine.
Totally. And I mean, you're working out in the building, you're working out with the strength staff that you're going to be with during the season, and that stuff's valuable. But a lot of guys have to leave the city that they call home in the off season, and after the season just ended. I mean, if you're playing to January, I mean, I don't want to get into that on this Jets podcast about playing into January, deep into January, but then you report back early in April. But for the rookies, that was one of the conversations I had yesterday was it's huge for rookies. If they don't report till mid-June, I wonder how that would influence their play. They're getting all this extra time in the building, learning from the veterans, so
learning the playbook.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's interesting, but we'll see. I feel like the, OTAs conversation about, when it's going to start is all leading to this potential eventual 18 game season.
Yeah.
That's where this is all headed. And I think when you tell fans an extra game, they're going to be all in for that. So we'll have to see over the next few years. The next CBA is 2030?
Yeah, but they can do concessions before that, of course, which I'm sure they will. But I will say, and I think Robert Salah kind of talked about this a little bit today, like, I get the idea that they need more of a ramp up period in training camp. And like, he thinks that's why a lot of injuries happen because, you know, you do these OTAs and then they just all go their separate ways for 40 days and they might not be working out as much. And then they come back and then injuries happen. So like, I don't think you need to do a month and a half earlier, but if you go a couple weeks earlier in July, I get that. Like, and you know, maybe not necessarily, we're not all there, but it's that beginning stage where they're like, kind of like the COVID year, they did that ramp up.
Exactly. Like the COVID year.
I think players like that a lot.
Yeah. And like phase 1 and phase 2 of OTAs, I believe were just virtual. So you met daily.
Yeah.
But meetings were virtual. So you still had that, you know, film time, but you didn't have to report to the city that you play in, and you could work out in your respective cities. So yeah, it'll be interesting to watch, definitely.
All right, let's get down back to
Jets
now,
OTAs.
These OTAs that are happening.
Yes.
And you've been there, Zach, as we mentioned. But let's talk a little bit about today, and we can reference back to last week as well. You were there. But Robert Salah speaking today, and he talked about a bigger role on the offense. For one thing, his quote that he came out with was, "For me, last year was year one with Hackett. A lot of learning for me. First time I've been part of an offense with a quarterback who has such a voice as Aaron Rodgers. It's year two. It's a natural evolution. I have a really good grasp of the offense. It's just trying to provide insight from a defensive perspective." All of that makes sense. But obviously, when people hear that Robert Salah is having more of a role on the offense, they just take it as no one likes Nathaniel Hackett.
Yeah. Yes. You know, you don't blame him for getting more involved. You know, this was alluded to. We talked about this in the summer because Woody Johnson mentioned it on the red carpet way back when, how Robert was going to be more involved. And then Joe and Robert kind of downplayed it at the owners' meetings. But you know who didn't downplay it was Aaron Rodgers last week when he said Robert Salah has been more involved with the offense. So, and then Robert didn't downplay it anymore because you know, the head honcho brought it up. But
the PR department had already brought it up.
Yeah. But yeah, you know, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You know, I think, and his point today was he's bringing a defensive perspective to the offense. That's he obviously doesn't have an offensive background necessarily, but he did come up in the San Francisco coaching tree, and you know, he was around Kyle Shanahan and all those guys over there. This is a different system than that. There's a lot of similarities, but it is a different one, especially because to his point, it's, you know, a lot of it's run by the quarterback. It's the quarterback making a lot of the decisions. And one of the things Rodgers said is that Robert was bringing a lot of ideas to the table. So clearly, sitting back and seeing everything last year, I think it's a good thing that he's getting more involved. I think this all goes in line with the idea that they need to be better prepared for the worst case scenario, which they were not prepared for last year. I think last year was a very big learning experience for everybody. Obviously, there's the big Hackett question that's looming over all of this. He's the biggest question they have beyond the health stuff. He's the biggest question they have. There's only so many different ways we can say it. He did not do a good job last year. His best years have been when Aaron Rodgers has been running the show, but you need an offensive coordinator that you trust. And, you know, as you know, it's been talked about ad nauseum at this point. They did look to hire people and they weren't able to bring anybody in. So Hackett is the play caller and he has to play.
Which Hackett denied this week too, right?
He didn't necessarily deny
downplayed.
He downplayed it. Yeah, he downplayed it. But I mean, it's a fact. It happened, and they can frame it however they want. But they did look at other coaches to, if not take away his play calling, then at least to make it more of a collaboration is how we reported it back in January. But yeah, so Robert being more involved, I saw something that maybe he was more involved at the end of last season as well. He started getting a little more involved. I didn't hear anything like that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's true. You're the head coach, everybody's jobs are on the line. His whole thing has always been he gives the keys to the offensive, defensive, and special teams coordinators, lets them run their show, and he's kind of at the top overseeing everything. When the offense is as bad as it's been in his time here, and they refer to last year as year one, as if they started over and the first 2 years in the system didn't count. I don't necessarily agree with that. I know they did change the system, but they did make the choice to fire LaFleur. It's not we had a reset because of X reason or whatever.
They did actually draft Zach Wilson.
They drafted Zach Wilson, all that stuff. So I don't think you can just pretend those first 2 years on offense didn't exist, because they did. I think it's important for him to get more involved. I think he has a good football mind. It's not a bad thing. I wonder this season, and again, this is worst case scenario, so there's no reason to believe it will happen unless Rodgers gets hurt. But if things are going poorly on offense and Hackett's not doing a good job, like does Robert step in and call plays? Does he pass the responsibilities on to Todd Downing? Like these are questions that will come up as the season progresses. He didn't strip the play calling away at all last year. It was all Hackett the whole way. And that might have been a mistake at the end of the year, but they knew they were going to bring him back clearly. So, and you have to maintain that relationship because of Rodgers and all those complicated things on the side. But yeah, it's not surprising that Robert's getting more involved. It's just interesting that it's finally like they're publicly acknowledging it. And I don't necessarily think it's as negative of a sign about Hackett as you might think. I just think, again, as he said, he's a year into it, but the offense needs to be better. So it's all hands on deck. And that's kind of where I view this.
And there's plenty of ways a defensive coach can help the offense. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Yeah. So, all right, we've mentioned Aaron Rodgers enough. He's back, obviously. He's out on the field, and he's looking good for the most part.
Yeah. He's, Connor, because he likes to repeat the same things over and over again. He said this a lot the last 2 practices, but he said like, so that's what it's supposed to look like watching like a quarterback play in practice. Because, I didn't cover the team for that long, just since 2022, but even myself, Zach Wilson, for all his great throws, would make a lot of bad ones too. Mike White was never a great practice guy. Joe Flacco was up and down too. And over the years, this fan base and these reporters in training camp have seen a lot of bad quarterback play where, you're maybe celebrating the good plays because the bad ones are really bad or whatever. And Rodgers doesn't have a lot of bad plays, if any. Like there's some passes that miss, but like you get where he was going with it, or he threw it the right way and the receiver didn't get to it, which we'll get to with one guy in particular today. But yeah, his accuracy is just unreal. His ability to just pinpoint and like put it in a place where only the receiver can get it, even when they're tightly covered. Like if you get open, he's going to find you. Like that's a fact. And his connection with Garrett Wilson continues to be the most fun thing to watch because Garrett can catch anything if it's in his general vicinity. Rodgers has thrown it behind him. Garrett's caught it. He had a diving catch today along the seam. That was really impressive. But yeah, Aaron is he's made for these settings. He's made to like light it up in practice because he's so good at accuracy and there's not hitting right now. And he knows that. So you can maybe do even some of the more risky passes if you really wanted to. We haven't seen a lot of throwing it downfield. He did throw it a couple times. He didn't hit anything. DJ Reed broke one pass up down the field. Alan Lazard wasn't able to bring one down. So it hasn't been a lot of down the field stuff. Haven't really had to see him moving around a lot, which is kind of like the next step when we watch him coming off the Achilles, how he looks. He won't get hit until whenever he plays in a game, maybe not the preseason, probably the first game of the season, which is a long time to go between hits, obviously. And that's always a concern for a guy coming off an injury.
What about joint practices?
Joint practices, I guess there's always
because there's a lot of them.
That was actually news today that I forgot to put in the rundown that they're going to be doing joint practices with all 3 teams they're playing.
That's crazy.
Washington, I believe, will be 2 days. It'll be the whole week with Carolina again in Carolina. So I'm going back to Spartanburg, and then it'll be 1 day with the Giants. It was kind of a trade-off from 2 years ago. They didn't do it last year because they played in the regular season. So that'll be fun. Joint practices are way more fun than the preseason games, so I'm happy with it. So, and
because that's where you see more of the starters,
you see yourself against, you see them against like opponent that's not the same player you've been going against all off season. And the Jets, it's pretty telling. You can usually tell how good or bad a team's going to be or what areas are problems in these practices. And if you remember on Hard Knocks, the offensive line was awful against the Carolina that week. And they highlighted that on the Hard Knocks. And obviously the offensive line was an issue last year. It's just, you're able to see a little bit better. These 3 teams they're going against are not, I would say, the most talented they have on their schedule, or the most talented that they could have had on their preseason schedule. Like Washington, the rebuilding, they have some talent. The Giants, I think, are going to be one of the 5 worst teams in the NFL. And the Panthers were a disaster last year. We'll see what they look like this year. But anyway, like that, those are exciting. And I do wonder if that leads to Aaron not playing in any of the preseason games because he's going to be getting those reps there and because they probably want to hide him in bubble wrap. I'm curious how much Tyron Smith is going to practice then, how much Mike Williams. They have a lot of guys who they're going to be limiting their workload to a degree. So it's going to be fascinating to see if they get all the reps in those joint practices as well.
And it'll be good. Like last year, Aaron Rodgers not playing much in the preseason. It meant all right, what are we going to see at quarterback, right? Like, I
Yeah.
guess we had some excitement to see if Zach had progressed, but it'll actually be good to see how Tyrod Taylor looks in the preseason, assuming that at some point along the way, he'll probably have to play a little bit.
Yeah,
I would think even if Rodgers stays relatively healthy next year, there's probably going to be bumps and bruises,
if Jordan, I'm skeptical when he'll come back, but if Jordan Travis is able to get back to practice at some point, he'd be the one that the preseason will be fun to watch because those are the reps. Ideally, those are only reps he's going to get this year. So hopefully he can come back.
He's an exciting player in general, too.
He's not practicing right now. Obviously, he had a pretty serious injury, and it was in November. So I imagine it'll be a redshirt year for him, but they haven't signed like any legit other quarterbacks. So I think the plan is for him to be the third quarterback. So that he's another guy. And those joint practices, like with the young guys too, like that's where you kind of see if a young guy is showing up in Jets practice, how does he look against another opponent? And then you kind of know, okay, this young guy might be something. And like you kind of saw, I'd say last year, Jermaine Johnson, it was a second year, but he had been dominating in Jets camp and he carried it over to the joint practices that we saw with the Panthers. So you do see stuff like that in there, and Rodgers, and he's competitive and he wants to beat the other side. And so you see a lot of competitive juices flowing when it comes to that stuff.
All right. Besides Rodgers, how about some other big observations from OTA practices? Let's start with the negative. We've teased it a little bit here. I think there was a hope that with Rodgers' return, we would see like the chemistry with Lazard rekindled and he'd be back to what the Jets thought they were signing, but not so much so far, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to make any sweeping conclusions out of OTAs, but yeah, he's been off to a little bit of a bumpy start, at least in the practices that we saw. He had 2 drops today that I remember. I know he had at least one last week when we watched practice. He went one-on-one with Quantuet. There was a point where they're doing 11-on-11 in the red zone, and the starting defense came off and some backups came in. And so basically they put backup cornerbacks in. Quantuet Stiggers, who we talked about extensively on here with Nick Baumgartner, didn't play in college, only played in the CFL last year. He kind of shut him down on a Alan Lazard didn't really position himself very well. It was good coverage. And it was like a fade from Aaron Rodgers in the corner of the end zone. And Allen just couldn't position himself to go and get it. And he dropped one at the pylon a couple plays later. This is an opportunity for him to get a lot of reps with his guy. Mike Williams is not going to be ready to practice for a while, probably not until after training camp starts. And Alan Lazard right now is the top backup on the outside for Mike Williams. So these are the chances for him to go out and prove that he deserves to play, because he's not a guy that does anything on special teams. And Boyd Green kind of alluded to this in the comments. Because of the receivers they have and the fact that he doesn't play on special teams, there's a legit chance he's a healthy scratch every week as long as Mike Williams is healthy. Because you have Mike Williams, Garrett Wilson, Malachi Corley, who we'll get into, who got banged up today. You have Xavier Gibson, who I feel pretty safely is going to be on the active roster. Irv Charles is the new Justin Hardy. Jason Brownlee, everybody's raving about constantly. And so it'd be between Brownlee and Lazard, and Brownlee plays on special teams. So if those are all the guys they keep, what is Lazard's role? Why would you bring him up? He's not that good of a run blocker that you need to keep him in there. I think he actually wasn't very good as a blocker last year either. He was the least productive receiver in the NFL last year. I'm not just trying to do a pile on Alan Lazard episode. I think there's been enough of that, but they're kind of stuck with him because of his contract. It was a disappointing start to OTAs. It's not over for him. I think having Rodgers around should help. Maybe he needs to build his confidence back up because, there with good reason, it was pretty shot last year, I would say, even if he talks about himself like he's pretty confident still, as he should. But, it was not a good day for him. And I know he's an easy target for fans because of how bad he was last year in his contract. But ideally, he's looking like maybe not a $44 million receiver, but more like the receiver he was in Green Bay. So you can feel okay, if Mike Williams is taking a while to come back or isn't himself or has a setback, we at least have this proven veteran guy right here, and he hasn't shown that he can be that guy yet.
You mentioned Corley banged up today, but I think you said he's probably okay. But beyond that, he's also looked really good.
Yeah. We haven't seen a lot of him, I would say. Garrett Wilson had a great quote about him. He said that boy is a brute, is what he said about him, because he runs through people and all that stuff. He fit. It's funny because they drafted him essentially to be a better version of Xavier Gipson in like that kind of like gadget slot receiver type role. But Xavier's like a small dude, whereas like Malachi he's 5'10", which is relatively short for a receiver, but he's yoked like that. He's jacked, and he's gonna be fun to watch if he's healthy. But he came off the field. I didn't see what happened. He went off the field with the trainer, came back without his helmet, and sat out team drill. So Xavier got a lot of reps. He's looked pretty good too. But yeah, I got the impression that it's not anything to be concerned about with Malachi from texting with somebody. But yeah, he's a guy that these reps are he hasn't signed his rookie contract either. He's only one that hasn't done it, but he's still been at practice, which is interesting. A lot of times these guys will hold out or whatever. So
I think there's some sort of protection in there, but that is interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a good sign that he's there despite that. And these contracts are all like basically preset. I think it's maybe down to like the guaranteed money or whatever. So I don't know what's the hold up on that, but
that contract might be getting signed like as we speak, especially
after getting banged up.
Yeah. He's like, what am I doing?
Yeah. But yeah, Xavier Gipson's getting those reps now with Aaron that Malachi would be getting. I do think Xavier will have a chance, at least at the outset, to, be the slot receiver. They did trade up to get Malachi, but the best players are going to play. If Rodgers has chemistry with Xavier, which he seems to, Xavier will get reps. So I think it is important for Corley to get some of these reps this time of the year in particular, as we were talking about earlier, like rookies getting these reps is pretty crucial because this is like the first time they're going against NFL players, NFL speed, all that stuff. So hopefully he comes back pretty soon. We're going to be at practice twice next week, so we'll get a good look at him. But yeah, it's nothing to be concerned about. I know everybody freaks out that the worst case scenario is happening when it comes to injuries, but I think he's going to be fine.
As long as Salah doesn't say he's going.
Yeah. To Salah's credit, he was asked today about, I believe, Mike Williams. Like, do you have like a firm timetable? He's like, I don't really want to make any predictions. So
good.
He's learned. So I almost cheered. Right. I almost clapped for him.
Other rookies, Braylon Allen has looked good so far, right? And you said pass catching as well as rushing.
Yeah. I think he always looked like of the guys they've added these last 2 years at running back, he's like a perfect complement on paper for Breece Hall anyway, because as like a big back, good in protection. He did catch the ball somewhat in college, and I think Dane did like his potential as a pass catcher, but he has looked pretty good in that. He's run some good routes. He's beaten like some linebackers in coverage, and he showed some juice after the catch. So he's a guy that I'm very intrigued by as the RB2 to Breece. Maybe he doesn't get a huge workload at the beginning of the year, but as the year goes on, Breece is obviously going to probably be near the top of the NFL in touches. But I think Braylon can spell him and provide something a little bit different. And so I'm very intrigued by that. Isaiah Davis is there too. A little concerned about Izzy. They just added Tariq Cohen, who we're going to talk about at some point soon. But yeah, Braylon has impressed me. I think number 0 is just like kind of like a badass number. I think something about a 0 on a running back is just kind of cool. So there's also that aspect where I'm like, I don't know. He's like this big running back with the number 0, and it just like works.
Yeah, I like that.
That.
You mentioned, good transition to Tariq Cohen. Signed today, former 4th-round pick. He's now 28 years old. He tore his ACL in 2020, spent 2021 on the Bears PUP list. He's been on the Panthers practice squad, but it sounds like he's actually finally really healthy, and the Jets seeing what they can get from him here in the spring. Yeah.
It's it's an interesting signing at the least. He's a guy that he was on the Panthers practice squad last year. He's had crazy bad injury luck. It was in 2020. He had just re-signed with a big deal with the Bears, and then he tore his knee up like in like 3 different places. Like if you look it up, it's ACL, MCL, and there was like another part of it that broke. And then a couple of years later, and he was trying to come back, he tore his Achilles. So like that's just like terrible luck. He's not like a big guy. Obviously, he's pretty short. He was a Pro Bowl returner with the Bears, great pass catcher out of the backfield. He showed some burst today. I mean, I'm not going in with a lot of expectations for a guy who's been out of the league essentially since 2020. The Panthers cut him a couple weeks ago. It's not like the Panthers are like, the best team in the league or anything to be cutting guys that are good. So, he showed some burst today. He had a nice big run on a toss from Tyrod, got some reps with Aaron in 7-on-7. He's an intriguing guy. You hope you bring him all the way to training camp. It's a fun training camp storyline. Salah cited like the new return rules, which are going to lead to like 100 plus returns per team this season, essentially. Like, so you need more than one guy. And so Xavier Gipson is one of them. and Cohen has a chance to push for another spot. I mentioned the running back room. You have Breece Hall, you have Braylon Allen, you have Isaiah Davis. I would say are the locks two guys they just drafted, and Breece. Izzy pushing for a spot. I'm not very confident he's going to make it. Nick Bodden is a guy who plays on special teams. They like him as a blocker. And then you have, I think Tarik Cohen can push for something. And I don't know how to say his name, but he was on the team last year and one of those that's on the practice squad, and you don't remember that he's there. But his name is that Xavier. It's spelled weird, but Xavier Valade. He's been getting a lot of reps, and OTAs has looked pretty good too. So it depends on how many running backs they keep. But Tarik has, he's the only veteran of the group. So if he can show some of what he was before the injuries, like he's absolutely like a fun player they could keep around here.
All right. I think that kind of, is there anything else from the OTAs here this week that we want to get to before we talk about wide receiver money?
Yeah, I would say, I last week's observations, I shouted out a UDFA and I shouted out another one today. They're both defensive linemen, so I just wanted to bring them up now. Eric Watts from UConn, he had the highest guaranteed money out of all their UDFAs that they signed. He probably is the best shot of making the team out of this group. He looks like a big dude, like he's tall, and he's impressed me so far. He can play inside and outside, I think, and they need somebody like that with JFM. Although I wouldn't be surprised if Jermaine started doing a little bit of inside-outside type stuff too. But they don't have a lot of depth at defensive end right now, so there's openings to be had. And then there's Brady McGregor from Michigan, had the second highest guaranteed money. He flashed to me today. Interestingly, he's wearing John Franklin Myers' old number, and Eric Watts is wearing Carl Lawson's old number. So it's been an adjustment, like looking at those numbers and trying to remember like that is these new players who look different. But Braden, he's a high motor defensive end. I think he can play on special teams. Guy from Michigan, and he made a few plays today. He would have sacked the third string quarterback Paisley. He pressured Tyrod Taylor at one point. So I think those are two guys that can push for roster spots because they need some depth on the defensive line.
All right. So Nico Collins, the latest wide receiver to get paid, 3-year extension with the Texans yesterday, $24 million per year, which ranks him 7th in the NFL.
Wow.
You forget all these contracts. Like I saw that number and I was like, oh, he's one of the top, 2 or 3 guys. And he's 7th because AJ Brown's at $32 million a year.
Crazy.
Amon-Ra St. Brown is $30 million a year. Tyreek Hill, 30. Devontae Adams, 28. Cooper Kupp, 26.7. Devontae Smith, 25. How about the Eagles?
I was going to say
$57 million
Gosh.
to their receivers.
And their quarterback's making a lot of money.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
They handed out so many big contracts this
Yeah.
offseason. It's insane. I don't know
How
how
he's doing some magic over there.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, is their owner is willing to give all this cash out too, as part
Right.
of it. But yeah.
Somehow you have to make it all work. As you say, that it is not fake money, though. You do have to make it work. And then Collins there at $24 million. Yet to come, Jefferson,
Yeah.
Jamar Chase, and eventually Garrett Wilson.
Yeah, Garrett's got to be looking at all of this and getting antsy because he has to wait. I mean, the Jets don't exactly have a history of signing these guys early, which should be noted. But depending on Garrett has a lot of leeway to be like, this situation has been terrible for me, and if it's bad again this year, like he could either. I'm not saying he's going to, but I'm saying it would be within his right to be like, trade me or pay me now, because I've played with a million quarterbacks. We've lost X amount of games. He wore his heart on his sleeve last year. He was a leader for the team in his second year. He's been very open about how upset it was making him when they were losing the same way and not adjusting and all that stuff. Despite all of that, he has the most receptions out of any Jets receiver ever in their first 2 years. And he's, already almost unanimously, you hear people talk about him like he's one of the 10 best receivers in the league. And they're all basing it on the fact that he's so talented and hasn't had a quarterback throwing to him. But yeah, you look at the contracts. Nico Collins has had one good year in 3 years. I think he's a very talented guy, but this is his first good year in his third year. And he's got $24 million a year. I think Garrett's better than Devontae Smith, personally. And it's not even about better. It's just more about when you're at that echelon of receiver with each contract, the bar gets raised. And so,
Right.
I've seen some speculation. I think maybe Mike Florio from Pro Football Talk has been the one suggesting the idea that maybe receiver contracts might go the way of running backs because there's so many receivers and so many good ones coming out every year. Does that devalue it? But I don't see that happening. I think when you have a star like him that's young, and ascending, like you do whatever you can to keep them. And that's why all these teams are paying this huge money. So,
and their careers, like part of the running back thing is that how many good years are you going to get out of a running back, right? Whereas receivers can play.
Yeah, they're not taking as many hits in theory. Yeah. So Garrett hasn't even like touched even remotely close to his ceiling because of the bad quarterback play, and getting a good quarterback with him is the next step. He's gotten so much better with each year, and that you like forget about where he started. Cause I do, when he was a rookie, it was all athleticism and he was making flashes, but he was having a lot of drops in training camp. And I think his route running left something to be desired, but he was just making plays left and right. I remember as a rookie last year, he takes it to another level with Aaron there. And now it's just like, he just is such an expert out there. He knows where to be at all times. You know that wherever if the ball is within his vicinity, he's going to be able to go and get it. He's going to win one-on-one battles, even if he's not like, getting a lot of separation. Like, he's just an expert receiver. I think Jets fans should really, really appreciate the quality of person and player they have in him. And you hope the Jets as an organization, are willing. They're about to enter a very interesting stage, because this is like a whole larger discussion that we'll have over the course of the next year. Not only you're going to have to pay him soon, you got to pay Sauce soon. He's going to reset the corner market. If Jermaine keeps ascending like I think he will, you're going to have to pay him. And then there's Breece Hall, who is surely going to be looking for top running back money, which isn't as high as the others. But I don't know if you can afford to pay all four of those guys. But Garrett and Sauce are obviously the priority, I think. And Garrett in particular, it's just because you're seeing all these receiver contracts, I don't think you see as many corners. Like, teams are getting these receivers earlier now too, with the idea that if they wait a year, it's, if the Texans had waited a year for Nico, maybe they would have had to pay him $27 million. Like, it's going to be approaching $30 million a year for the top receivers by the time Garrett signs on the dotted line. And will Woody Johnson be willing to pay that like 2 years away from, you have his rights for 2 more years? Would he do that? I don't know. I think that's going to be a very interesting part of next offseason. But that he sees this money, and he knows the situation he's been dealt and how bad the offense would have been without him. Look how bad it was with him. Now imagine it without Garrett the last 2 years.
I feel like this year is going to be so telling, though. You know, like, if this year they finally been waiting for, then I think, you got to pay him.
Yeah, and then he goes out and gets 100 catches and 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns, and then Jamar Chase hasn't been paid yet. Justin Jefferson hasn't been paid yet, and they're better than Garrett. Right. But he's like approaching their level, and so once those guys reset the market, like fully reset it, then it's gonna be interesting to see where guys like Garrett land, and some of the other guys that have contracts coming up too. Like, even Jerry Jeudy with the Browns just got a bigger contract than I expected. Like, the money is there for receivers right now.
Well, when you look at these top contracts, though, one thing you see is, like, for whatever reason, obviously partly plays into what they're able to do. But a lot of these teams have good in their prime or younger quarterbacks, right? Like Eagles. And whereas when you look at Garrett, when he's getting to this point, doing it next year makes a lot of sense, because assuming Aaron's going to come back for one more, okay, we can get him to sign. What if it goes to the next year, and who's the quarterback? Like, and then can you convince Garrett Wilson, hey, you played 2 years with terrible quarterbacks, we're going to draft someone? Like, there's no.
Well, that's why beyond him to trust beyond the obvious reasons that they need a win, just because they haven't forever and all the other stuff and people's jobs on the line, they're getting pretty close to where they have to pay all these guys, and so they already have a bad cap sheet. By the way, like, they have so much dead cap on their books for next year.
It's amazing, because 2 years ago they were so, like, they had so much money.
Yeah. Well,
so much happened.
They had Zach quickly. Their quarterback was on a rookie contract,
right?
Rodgers.
He's found it being bad, so that didn't help. But so they're about to having to pay. Michael Carter II is going to be a free agent. DJ Reed, a lot. Tyron Smith, Mike Williams, 1-year deals. Like, they have a lot of holes they're going to have to fill on top of having to pay these guys who are going to want to get paid. So it's they're entering interesting territory. So if you go in and win this offseason, then maybe things are a little bit better, and maybe you can get some hometown discounts and all that good stuff. But if
you have to go in and win.
Yeah. Anyway, like, obviously you have to win. Like, that's an obvious statement.
But if you don't, you're.
But like, financially, it's like the whole, when you have a guy on a rookie contract quarterback, like the Texans are doing what you're supposed to do. You go and spend a lot, and the Jets are kind of doing that, just not with the quarterback. Like, they've like 4 stars under rookie contracts, and so they went and spent all these veterans to fill out the roster. And they need it to work, because they're about to lose all that money. So,
Yeah. I feel like we
Yeah.
started with this, like, so much optimism, OTAs, optimism.
well,
yeah. And
there's-
now we're
there's-
like,
I mean,
hey, Jets
I
fans.
should say this is a reason for celebration that they have guys of this quality that they drafted.
Yeah.
Like
Agreed.
Quinton Williams is like the only one really that they drafted that was at this level in a long time. They did sign him. It came down to the wire and all that. I guess not down to the wire because he had a year left on his deal or whatever. But so yeah, this is all a positive that they have these guys, but you're gonna have to pay them soon. So that's just something to think about. Like Joe Douglas's 2022 class, whatever happens this year, is going to go down in history as maybe the best in team history. Like you don't have teams that get 4 studs like that in 1 year. And then you have like a Max Mitchell and a Michael Clemens who are like rotational backups or whatever, which is like solid. And you have Tony Adams as a UDFA from that year too, who's a starting safety. Like that's just unreal hit rate on these absolute studs. And the other drafts have left some to be desired, but that one was just phenomenal. And everybody's getting better in that group. Sauce Gardner is arguably the best corner in the NFL. Garrett Wilson, arguably top 10 receiver. Jermaine Johnson is ascending. Breece Hall is going to be one of the 10 best running backs if he's not already. So like that's pretty unreal for one draft class. And the consequence of that is you have to pay all of them. It's not a bad thing, but it is a thing the Jets are going to have to confront next offseason because that's the first year we're talking about next offseason because the first year it's after their third season is when you can start giving a contract extension essentially. So the Jets haven't done that very much in recent or long-term history, but if they were ever going to do it, Sauce and Garrett are the ones to do it with.
Yeah, and because you don't want to do them all at once, it's better to
Yeah.
stagger them over a couple of
For
years
sure.
too. So that
We were just asked like who would get paid first. If I'm putting money on it, I would say Sauce, but you know he's going to want to reset the market at corner. So that's not.
I would say of that list, Sauce, Garrett, Jermaine, Breece, that Boy Green put in there, Breece is definitely last, right? I mean,
as a
it's
running
just
back,
the way it goes with running backs. Like,
I mean, look at Saquon. Yeah,
we could see Breece leave. You know what I mean? It's definitely a world where you have to sign all these guys. It's always the running back who misses out.
Yep. And the irony is that he'd be the cheapest one out of them, but it's just like investing in running backs is usually bad. But yeah, it's gonna be an interesting couple of years in terms of the financial side of things for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Anything before we say goodbye?
No, they got 2 practices next week, and then they got the mini camp practices the week after that. So we'll probably I would guess we'll do our next pod that week, the mini camp week, if we're all on. My wedding season is coming up, so
mine is approaching.
I'm on vacation next week, but I'll be back.
Perfect.
Okay.
I'm going to California next weekend. I'm excited. But yeah, fun summer ahead. And then we'll have that little lull while we'll try and get some guests or something on the pod, have some fun. But yeah, keep an eye out for the OTA stuff, off-season stuff. I'm sure they'll sign somebody at some point. Like Joe always signs a veteran before training camp. But yep. So we'll be back next week and check back at the Athletic for 2 weeks. Sorry, 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And check back at the Athletic for all the observations and stuff like that I'm writing.
Crushed it.
Zach doing my job for me.
Tim,
Outstanding. I'm out of here. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.